She will not force
Could I just ask you before we start, so that you're all in a very good humour, to spell one word for me, each of you. Are you prepared to do this? Yes. And then you can ask all your friends the same thing. And the question is very easy. How do you spell Bannister, the one I just came up on there? All right, not Sir Roger Bannister. There is a banister, and it's either got one N or two N's. And this is a bit of original research from my point of view. And I want you to put your hand up if you believe there is one N in Bannister. Hands up, please. It's awful, isn't it? Huh? Because you think there's only two possibilities, and I bet you I'm one of the people who's in the wrong camp. Can we just have another quick show on the one ends? Growing, isn't it? Then could we please have each of you hands up if it has got two ends? Oh. A lot of you still in the middle of nowhere, I can see that. Well, let me tell you something, shall I? The word banister, in Chambers' dictionary, is the one word I've ever met, and I know the dictionary well, which says B-A-N-I-S-T-E-R, one N, and then after that it says it says, but from the orthographic point of view, spelling, and from the etymology angle, it is now agreed in all the higher echelons of English literature that two N's is perfectly proper. And so everybody here got it right, didn't they? And I think this is a good thing when you can start off with a correct spelling, isn't it? No, then we've got some question and answer. I ought to tell you straight away that I can't see at all well, and I've never been able to hear, and I can't walk these days. And I have got a season ticket for every medical department. Yeah? Every medical department in all the hospitals within the environment of Oxford. I only say this because I want to tell you, you're not going to expect too much of me, are you? Is that right? And when it comes to questions, David is going to tell me what they are. When I used to work here in Oxford for the examination board, one of my colleagues went along to talk to the grammar school railway society in Tipping Norton. Have you heard of Tipping Norton? Yes. Well, that's a good start anyway. And he went to talk to the railway society there about the pre-war transport system in Schleswig-Holstein. Well, you can imagine that was a big draw for the boys, wasn't it? And my colleague who went there talking to them, he said he spoke rather too long, he thought. And right at the end, to muted applause, he sat down and the teacher said, alas, our distinguished speaker has agreed to stay for another half hour to answer all the questions you have, boys. And he said, well, I've been talking, and he said, long enough for you to think of a question. He said, could we then have the first question? Have you been to a meeting like that? Nobody's interested enough even to ask a question. And he said, it's all right, the boys are just formulating their question, he said. Formulating. He said, give them a chance, and he gave them 2 minutes. And finally he said, well, you've had your chance, boys. Could we please have the first question now? Have you been to meetings like that? It's a bit embarrassing, isn't it? But finally, one boy on the back row, and there were only 4 boys there. One boy on the back row put his hand up, and the teacher was ever so pleased, and he said, yes, my son, what is your question? And the boy said, please, sir, is it time to go home yet? Well, anyway, there it is. There it is. So we should be all right if you sit and formulate while I'm talking, all right? Now then, when I had an invitation to come along and talk to you this afternoon, I thought it was a very, very polite and a very, very appropriately friendly letter from David. Far better than the worst letter I've ever had in my life. Do you want to hear what that was? The worst letter I've ever had. Dear Colin Dexter, we are holding our annual village church garden fete on the 24th of June this year. And I have been, this is from the minister of the church, and I have been casting around comma, rather desperately for some minor local celebrity to come along and open the fete for us. Please reply to this invitation, if you will, as soon as possible, since time is now desperately short. Please come along and try to help us. Yours sincerely. So that was that. You won't be surprised, I know, to learn that it so happened that on the 24th of June I was extremely busy all day. And there it is. There it is. And I thought, just to balance that, would you like to hear the best letter I've ever had in my life? Are you sure? A long time ago, from a Mrs. Jennifer Elliott of Reading, and she says, Dear Colin Dexter, I was lying in bed with my husband last night. They're not all as interesting as this letter. And when my husband asked me what I was reading, and when I told him that it was the latest Inspector Morse novel, he mentioned to me that he thought he had read in the newspapers, or perhaps heard on the wireless that you had recently passed away. I do hope, therefore, that you will fully understand how difficult it is for me to write this letter to you. And I can only hope that you are now feeling somewhat better. I hope, too, that you will be able to read this short letter. Please, please do write back to me if you can, for which purpose I enclose a stamped address envelope. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Jennifer Elliott. And then she put a postscript on the end, postscriptum. Why do you not put old Morse to bed slightly more frequently with some worthy or preferably unworthy woman? So that was that. Now, I enjoyed that. I wrote to this Mrs. Elliott, and I can't remember. I mean, that's what she wrote, but I can't quite remember exactly what I said, because I've never typed a word in my life. I've never typed a letter in my life, a letter of the alphabet. But I said to her, look here, I don't want... I don't want you to get the wrong idea about me at all. I said, we are a family program. And there's no need to worry about having your grandchildren there at all. They'll probably tell you what's happening anyway. But I said, there is no suggestion at all that you're going to get with me, either in the books or on the television, I only learnt this word recently, any raunchy description of activity between the sheets. I wrote and told her this. I thought it would be proper to give a fair warning, but I said, it's very nice, thank you very much for your letter. And if you've got a good memory, you can recall that she put a PS on the end of her letter, so I thought I would just have a little bit of fun with her. So I said, as I say, please don't get the wrong impression about me, Mrs. Elliott. I do write pornography, but under a different name. And the real difficulty about that was that she didn't write back at all. So I sent her a little photocopy of the nearest I come to talking in any way like that. This is what I sent her at the end of one of my books, The Way Through the Woods. Morse as having a party in North Oxford, what dear old John Thaw used to call leafy North Oxford. He sold another thing, and of course we had an awful lot of body bags in Morse, didn't we? My one claim to fame is that single-handedly I have made Oxford the murder capital of the European common market. You know that. And when my eyes went so badly I had to stop reading, at all. I went along to the oculist, or rather not the oculist, the optician, or the ophthalmologist, is that right? And I hope you're all going regularly along to see the ophthalmologist. I went along and I said, I think it's perhaps about time I stopped driving a car. And she said, we'll soon tell you. And she took me in a room and had to read all those letters. You know, I could see the top one, all right. But anyway, there it was. And she said, oh, well, we'll soon sort you out. She said, yes, it is time. It is time you stopped driving. Yeah. She said, you see, on the streets of Oxford, you've already murdered quite sufficient. Quite sufficient innocent men, women, and children. So I said, oh, well, this is rather sad. And she said, well, never mind. I said, when do you want me to stop? And do you know what she said? She said, please, before breakfast tomorrow morning. So there it was. Morse, he's having a party up in North Oxford. Do you remember Superintendent Strange in the Morse things? Lovely man, Jimmy Grout, wasn't he? Lovely man. And he's been invited, and of course, Sergeant, as he was then, Sergeant Lewis, and another person who had helped him, another chief inspector, in fact, up in Morse's bachelor flat, as I say, up in North Oxford. And he'd also invited a beautiful blonde he met in the course of his investigation. An awful lot of blondes he did meet. He fell in love with most of them, and most of them were crooks, of course. But anyway, there it was. Earlier in the evening, this lovely girl had written to him and said, unfortunately, I'm extremely busy and I shan't be able to come along and join the festivities this evening. And this is what I sent to Mrs. Elliot. Everybody's left and it's been a fiasco. Half an hour after Lewis had left, Morse sat listening to the party playing the slow movement of the Mozart Piano Concerto number 21. You always get a bit of culture in my books. You did know that, didn't you? When the doorbell rang. Now don't jump ahead too much in your mind. When the doorbell rang. It's a bit late, I know, she said. Are you still following the story, all right? Bit late, I know, she said. Actually, I'm cheating a bit there. It doesn't say she said in the text at all. But I wanted you to follow what was going on. What had been a semi-scowl on Morse's face now suddenly burgeoned into a wholly ecstatic smile. Nonsense! It just so happens I've got a couple of bottles of bubbly left. Will that be enough, do you think? She asked. I wish I had people who came along and made that sort of comment. Will that be enough, do you think? Come in, said Morse. I'll just turn this music off. Oh, no, please don't. I love it. I love it, she said. Kirkle 467, isn't it? She's beautiful and bright, isn't she? Where have you parked, asked Morse. You know, in Oxford, if you haven't seen somebody for 38 years or something, you know, and somebody knocks on the door, a dear old friend, instead of putting your arms around them and saying, my God, it's marvellous to see you again, you know what we all say? Where have you parked, asked me. I didn't come by car, she said. I thought you'd probably try to get me drunk. Morse closed the door behind them. I will turn it off, if you don't mind. I've never been able to cope with oh dear, with two beautiful things. at the same time. Well, I thought it was all right when I wrote it, anyway. She followed Morse into the lounge where once more he picked up bottle number 2. "What time will you have to go, my love?" And she said, "Who said anything about going, Chief Inspector?" This is a fine piece of writing, isn't it? Morse put down the bottle and swiftly retraced his steps to the front door, where he turned the key and shot the bolts both top and bottom. And I put, as I say, a little note at the bottom saying, you know, that this is as near as we ever came to getting into this raunchy, titillating sexual business. There we are. Anyway. Now then, what I'm supposed to be talking about, I just interrupt a moment and say I'm not quite sure, but if any of you here are interested at all in submitting anything to either the present Lewis television things, if you've got a good story, don't tell anybody about it. It's a rare thing to be able to fashion a story and write about it. We're in St. John's, aren't we, here? Aristotle once says, if you've got a story, what you want is a beginning and a middle and an end. And my great hero, Houseman, who was here, the greatest of the poet scholars, the scholar poets in the whole of English literature, he was here, and was Philip Larkin, wasn't he, in St. John's College. And Larkin said, no, that's nonsense, what Aristotle said. You're really a beginning and a muddle, and an end. If you're going to start from Oxford and decide that you're going to Edinburgh, you know, you can say, well, Oxford is where we'll find a few body bags and so on. 91 body bags we had. It's not because I was so besotted with what I had written that there it was, but somebody, when it was 69, wrote into me and said, do you know how many people you murdered in Oxford? 69. So I cut it out and put it on the side of the television. And after the next episode, I just put +3, you know. and I may have missed one or two, but anyway, it ended up. But I feel that if you are interested at all in seeing how you have to come along, and we'll go along and see. So I brought some here. There's no copyright. If you wanted to take, shall I leave them on here at the end? How you take 3 or 4 of these. There's plenty of it. No copyright problems at all. It's how you should, if you're anxious. If you've got some bright idea, get down to it, and you'd have to send them off as laid out in these sheets. They're just from old Morse and Lewis things, so I leave it there. I shan't be sending you an invoice or anything like that for them. Anyway, there we are. What I'm anxious to do, really, is to try to tell you a little bit about the origin of these things, but the difference between writing a book and then going on to television. The first thing, of course, to notice is that the television screenplay is about, I don't know, 1/4 as long as a book. The last book I wrote, The Remorseful Day, is 450 pages. And the television lasts, you think it lasts 2 hours, don't you? But it doesn't. If it's on ITV, you don't have 120 minutes. You have 102 minutes. because you have all the adverts coming in the middle and all the credits at the beginning, all of them. You're left with 102 minutes, and therefore some things have to give way, and sometimes it's rather sad, especially if somebody's particularly proud of what they've written. I know perfectly well that I never let anybody read my books at all until they went to the lovely girl who looked after me at Macmillan. And I know once I'd been to Lyme Regis. Do you know Lyme Regis? Yes? It's a lovely place, isn't it? And I booked a room looking over Lyme Bay, and there the waves always came in left to right as you looked at them. And the seagulls squawked by outside the window, and they looked, do you remember those pictures of the Japanese bombers that came along? And dipped their wings in the window, and the foam came back very slowly up the beach. Lovely. And I tried to do the best I could with describing this scene, and I thought it was beautifully done. And I said to my publisher, I said, and have a look at page 17. There's a wonderful piece of writing there. I won't tell you what it is, but it's about the tide coming in at Lyme Regis. And she didn't say anything for a long time. And finally, when I said, did you read that bit about the tide coming in at Lyme Regis? She said, oh, yes. She said, you're right. It was one of the nicest bits in the whole book. It's rather nice, wasn't it? And I said, I'm so glad you liked it. She said, could I just give you one suggestion? And I said, yes, if it'll help. She said, I think it will. She said, why don't you miss it out and get on with the story? And Dr. Johnson said, didn't he, whenever you think you have written something particularly fine, strike it out. I didn't strike it out, but I wish I had done. And Keats, you know, used to go to the South Coast a lot, didn't he? And I knew what she meant about something that was not just particularly fine, but marvelous. Keats, not in one of his odes, but in a letter to a friend, talks about the untumultuous fringe of silver foam. The first word, of course, doesn't exist. And since you know all about how to spell banister, how many U's are there in how many U's are there in untumultuous? Very good. You're obviously a very, very intelligent audience, you know. But isn't that a beautiful piece of writing? Keats to one of his friends, not in one of his poems. Anyway, as I say, we have to say, when we have to cut it down for television, you've got to miss something out. And I remember early on saying, these credits are getting far too long. They go on for about 10 minutes, don't they? And I said, for example, in one of the earlier ones, we had, somewhere in the middle of the credits, it said, second dog handler. Second dog handler. And then the name of this man who performed this noble act there. And I said, could I ask a question, please? I knew nothing about television. And he said, what do you want to know? I said, it's a puzzle, bit of a puzzle to me. I said, there's no mention of the first of the first dog handler. And he said, well, so what? I said, did he do something wrong? You know? And he said to me, typical Dexter, you know nothing as yet, do you, about television? He said, you missed the whole problem. He said, the real problem is Nobody could remember a dog in any of the episodes at all. But some of these things you get in credits are a little bit difficult to follow, aren't they? You know, like Gaffer. Do you know some of these? The one that worries us all more than anything. Best Boy. You ever thought about Best Boy? No, perhaps not. But there it is, Dope for the director of photography, and you don't know where you are. And I certainly didn't know where I was with the first dog handler. But there it is. What you can say about television is you've got to concentrate really on the story, the storyline. I could write a couple, do my best I could to get, you know, to get some description of the wonderful effect, like we've had in recent week, of the sunshine on this wonderful cinnamon stone you get on the cottages in Oxford. I could write, say, certainly one paragraph about it and feel quite pleased. And the camera can do it in 1/10 of the time and do it better. And if you are going to tell a story on the television, what you've got really to do is to concentrate on what is coming next. You see, television must concentrate on dialogue and photography. It's not got anything else at all, really. Not anything else at all, because you can't think on the television. Now then, when I first came to Oxford, I know that I hadn't read all Dickens novels by any means, but at S-level English, we had an unseen passage from Bleak House. Now, Bleak House seems to me the finest novel in the whole of the English language. And I thought, when I watched this, I could see very well in this. I thought that the production of that novel was absolutely excellent, and I bet an awful lot of people in the audience felt the same. Superb. And yet we couldn't think, and you know that miserable, malevolent fellow Tulkinghorn, don't you, in Bleak House. And in the book he just say he thought this and he thought that, but you can't think. But if you get a brilliant actor like dear old John Thaw was, anyway, when we were doing this was an unseen thing. It said it was about the floods are out in Lincolnshire, that we asked them to say, you know, how does Dickens portray this business of the wet in Lincolnshire? And I said, I think that's all right for these clever children aged 18. And the chairman, Dr. Ing, I-N-G, said to me, did you ever teach English when you were a schoolmaster, Colin? And I said, no, I never taught. I never taught English. She said, well, just a minute, have you ever read Bleak House? I said, no. She said, well, shall I tell you why you should? And for 3 or 4 minutes, this dear lady told me what a marvelous thing it was. You know, we had it in this paper. And when she'd finished, I couldn't wait for the meeting to finish and go and see why it meant so much to her. And 1 or 2 moments I've had in life like that, like all of us have, I think. Certainly, I remember I had a brother who died last year, who was a couple of years older than I am, and we used to sleep in the same bed, and he always stayed up longer than I am, and he was a great lover of classical music, and one night he was listening to something, and I couldn't get to sleep, and I went downstairs, you know, in these old wirelesses, and I said, look, I can't get to sleep. For heaven's sake, turn it off and come to bed. And he was listening to the third movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Not in fact my favorite symphony, but the third movement is wonderfully good. The first record I ever bought was in fact the third movement with the Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, which seemed to be extraordinarily moving. But there it was, he was listening to the third movement of Beethoven 9. And you know, a tear was running down his cheek. And at that particular moment, I thought, if music means as much as that to my brother, I ought myself to wonder if I couldn't climb onto the same bandwagon. And when I was about 15 at school, the senior English master, who never taught me, but he saw me in the school grounds, and he said, Dexter 2. I was Dexter 2. I had a brother who was Dexter 1. We didn't have any Christian names in those days at all, did we? I know one of my grandchildren, when he went to school, I said, what's it like at school? He said, all right. And I said, you got a nice teacher? She's all right. And what about all the people in the class? Oh yeah, they're all right. You know, you can see that some of my grandchildren are you know, almost as wide a vocabulary as they're. and I said, you know, what about the headmistress? And he said, oh, you mean Audrey? and things have changed, haven't they? So anyway, he called me Dexter 2. That's who I was, Dexter 2 in the class. And so that was that. He said, I've written to your father and told him to cancel your weekly subscription. I forget whether subscription to the Dandy or the Beano. And this was a great loss for me. I'm one of the few people in England who really was very upset when they stopped the News of the World coming. Because we used to have the one paper a week, and that was the News of the World on a Sunday. And we all used to look for this, you know, all these scantily clad women all over the place. And you know, I miss Desperate Dan. Do you remember Desperate Dan? With the cow pies? Yeah, we're on common territory now, aren't we? And he said, I'm going to cancel it. It's time you put away childish things. And he said, so that's gone. And he said, instead of that, he said, I want you to come along and into my study. This was in Stamford in Lincolnshire. And he said, all the books, he said, and you can take one a fortnight. There's only one condition, and that is that you read it. It was in the sixth form. We used to get in the sixth form ridiculously young in those days. But anyway, that was that. So I said I need some guidance, and I did get some guidance. And he gave me Tess of the D'Urbervilles to read. And there's some wonderful description, isn't there, that the veil of the great dairies and the veil of the lesser dairies. And some lines stick in your mind forevermore. When Tess goes away for the second time, on a time-scented, T-H-Y-M-E, on a time-scented bird-hatching morning in early May. It's lovely, beautiful stuff, and I began to realize what a tremendous descriptive writer, at the very least, Hardy was. So there it was. I read Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and that was marvelous. And by the time I left school, I had read all Hardy's. So I think he wrote 17 novels, all except one. All except one, which I'm keeping till my old age next week. And when we moved, my wife and I moved, we only moved once in Oxford, but I found, this is about 40 years later, I found this book. And in the front it had got Ex Libris, H.B. Sharp. And there it was. There, H.B. Sharp. So I rang the school and found out what his address was in the south of France, and I wrote off and said, I'm awfully sorry to have only just found this after all this time. And a fortnight later, I had a parcel in the post, same piece of paper, same bit of string, I think. And he said, yes, I wish we'd got to know each other a little better, Dexter too, he said. I would very much like to have been with you, but there it is. You were reading classics and you couldn't do everything. But he said it was very nice to meet you, and I'm so glad that you've begun to enjoy something better than the dandy at this time. And I look back on our brief time together with great pleasure, full stop. And then the little paragraph at the end said, as I say, I wish I'd got to know you better, he said, but what I'd not realized about you was that you're such a slow reader. That was the collected poems of W.B. Yeats. I've still got it, and he'd cross his name out and put mine, Colin Dexter, in the front. That was a huge factor in my life, from even a person who didn't teach me at all. But as I say, I think back upon both the music and the literature as well, certainly huge turning points in my life, and with a little bit of difficulty in reading and so on. I think that these moments, I bet almost everybody here has one or two people from school who had a profound, a disproportionate good effect upon you. But now I'm afraid I'm past my sell-by date. I find it very difficult to write anything or read anything for that matter. I ought to have known this many, many moons before, because I was signing books in Waterstones in Liverpool, and it said, Colin Dexter will sign books in Liverpool on whatever day it was. Yeah, we'll sign, and that'll be fine. 12 noon, and if anybody here knows definitively whether 12 noon is AM or PM, please see me afterwards. I've asked so many people. But anyway, there we were with all my books all around in this very, very large room from Waterstones. And I ought to warn you that you'll hear knowing, well, you will today, won't you? Some people talking who exaggerate a little bit. Did you know that? You know, because it sounds better if you just make it a little more interesting than it otherwise would have been. And anyway, the queue there, and the top of the queue was a very, very ancient woman, very, very old girl standing at the head of the queue. And I'm exaggerating now a bit, I'm afraid, because there wasn't a queue at all. But this old woman I'm not making up at all. I'm not making her up at all on this. She was there, and I was ever so glad to see her, because we were only the only two people in the room. It was nice to have a bit of company. And she said, I said, come along, it's fine. And she said, well, look here, I'm not going to buy a book. You do realise that, don't you? And I said, well, never mind. I said, it's nice to see you, you know, let's have a talk together. And she said, well, what I want to, really, I just wanted to see you and shake your hand and say how lovely it's been for me. I'm getting very old now, and as you can see, she said, and your television program has brought me immense joy. I said, well, it's ever so nice of you to come and tell me that. That's lovely. She said, I have told you, haven't I? I'm not going to buy a book. and I said, don't worry about it. I wanted to give her a whole set of books. That would have been all right. But anyway, there it was. She said, there's only one problem. There's only one problem about it. I can't quite remember the name of the program, she said. It's not awfully difficult to remember Inspector Morse, is it really? Anyway, that was it. That was it. And I said, it doesn't matter. And somebody else came into the room, so I thought it was time to say, safe journey home. So I said, and it's very nice. Thank you for coming to see me. I'm absolutely delighted. So we shook hands, and she walked away, but she only walked away about three or four paces, and then she turned around, and her eyes were glistening and gleaming, and I knew what it was. And then she walked back to me. She looked so pleased with herself, and we all know what she was going to say, don't we? Yeah. And she said, I've remembered the name of your television program. And I said, well done, well done. And she said, do you mind if I, just show off a bit and tell you that I saw it? And I said, that'll be fine. She said, it was called 1 Foot in the Grave. And I do wish the old girl well, but that was quite some time ago. I know I went there oddly enough, when they're from Waterstones, that was in Liverpool. But by the way, a bit of self publicity. I was in Liverpool only a couple of weeks ago. And if you listen to I think it's Radio 4, Boxing Day, make sure you have a look in the Radio Times, will you? Won't say any more. But anyway, I went there by train to Manchester. And this is when I ought to realise that, my star was sinking fast, because there was another one at Waterstones, and again this time, believe me, there was a little bit of a queue, not a long one, but a little bit. And this chap in his mid-20s said to me, would you sign this book, please, for my girlfriend, Janice? So I started writing, pen out, started writing for Janice, and he said, just a minute. That's Janis, not Janice. So I started writing for Janice, and he said, yeah, that's right, well done. He said, would you please write under that, please forgive me for what happened last night. And he said, I said, that's it. He said, no, would you please write underneath, I do most sincerely promise that it is never going to happen again. So I feel this getting near the end of the front page, the title page by now. And I said, that's it, is it? And he said, no, just sign your name at the bottom. So I wrote my name, best wishes, Colin Dexter or something, at the bottom. And do you know, ladies and gentlemen, I've been a little worried ever since that my beloved wife, to whom I've been married for 55 years, is going to walk along one day in Oxford by the second-hand and find this particular particular name, but it hasn't happened yet. That was in, and then I had sometimes I used to get a car or a chauffeur or chauffeurs to take me, but not all that often at all. But this time we went to a place none of you have ever heard of, from Manchester, called Winsford. Has anybody ever heard of Winsford? Yes. Well, which county is it in? Yes. Oh, my goodness me. Yeah. So I got there. I had a first-class ticket to Crewe. To Crewe, yes. So that was that. Well, not quite that was that, because there was only one thing that let me down a bit, and that is that there wasn't a first-class coach on the train. But when we got there, there was one taxi, and I think the taxi driver was asleep. But anyway, I knocked on the window, and I said, "Are you?" Yeah. Where do you want to go? I said, "I want you to take me to a good hotel in Winsford, please. This is in Crewe." And you know what he said to me? He said, "We haven't even got a bad hotel." Anyway, he took me along, and he said, anyway, it was all right, get in the back. So he was quite a nice sort of fellow, really. And everybody clearly knows Cheshire very well. And we kept passing these farms, you know, carrots for sale or something. And there was one that said potatoes for sale. On the left-hand side, potatoes for sale. I was very interested in this sign, potatoes, for two reasons. First of all, because it was spelt correctly. Huh? Do you remember that American vice president? What was his name? Oh, very good. You are awfully knowledgeable, aren't you? Yeah. There it was. I mean, Oxford, just as bad, you know. Oxford, you often used to see it on most greengrocers before the supermarkets came along. Potato''S. Yes? Yeah. Anyway, there it was. I was interested in this, and I said to the chap, you know, it's not nice to see it spelled correctly. Do you know, I almost forgot what the second reason was. You thought I had forgotten what the second reason was. Yeah. Some smart aleck from the outposts of Cheshire had come along and written underneath potatoes, twinned with pomme de terre. And anyway, I went along there. Some of these vice presidents get it in the neck, don't they? Do you remember Spyro Agnew? I mean, he was a joke, wasn't he? He had a holiday cottage, you know, one of the southern states, Georgia, I think it was. And they got yoiks and yobbos even in this splendid county of Cheshire. And one of our papers, it must have been the Sun or the Mirror, I should think, I forget which, but it said, he became vice president, didn't it, Spyro Agnew? And this man had written Spyro Agnew's holiday cottage burnt to the ground, it said, in this little article about this attack of arson. And it said, library consumed by flames. Full stop. Both books, it said. Comma. And he hadn't quite finished colouring one of them. The only reason I remember that is because it was a women's institute, and there were, you know, on the back of most crime books it says this must be the finest detective story written in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, doesn't it? On the back, you know, the Oxford Mail or the Oxford Times or something like that. But there wasn't any writing on the back of this book. I forget which one it was of mine. But when she turned it over, and it cost about, I don't know, about 17 and 6, whatever it was then, but pretty expensive, this book was. And instead of any of these quotes, there was a picture, a photograph of me on the back. And this woman is standing there, and she was only about 18 inches from me. She was here, and she looked at it, and she looked at the photograph, and then she looked at me. And she looked back in the photograph, and I thought, you know, she needed a bit of help. A bit of help. And I said to her, yes, I'm sorry it's so expensive, this book, but that's a photograph of me. And do you know what she said? Do you know something, she said? I thought it was. But she said, you do take an extremely flattering photograph, don't you? Which is not the greatest compliment in the world. And anyway, one could go on with this forevermore. But as I say, one thing that is complementary to not being able to think on the television, you see, if John Thaw is on the television, and he could think wonderfully well, with his eyes almost, John Thaw could. He didn't like corpses. He hated the sight of corpses, especially if people were not quite dead or something. And I know that people used to say, if only you'd look straight into the camera, John, straight into the camera, and just think why it is you don't like corpses, what upsets you about. So John could sit there like this, and looking like Rodin's Thinker, isn't it? In the middle of the television screen, looks like that. You almost expect in the legend to come up on the bottom, do not readjust your set. John Thaw is thinking, you know, something like that. But I have heard directors say to John, what I want you to do is to think. And he could do, you almost felt that you were in the mood, in the ambience of the whole thing, because he was somehow thinking about this. And they used to say to him, I want you to sit there and look straight into the camera for 30 seconds. I don't know whether you ever tried to do this, have you? When you get home, try to look in the mirror and see if you can look in the mirror without blinking for 30 seconds. Shall I tell you what happens? After about 10 or 11 or 12 seconds, you think, there's nothing in this at all. Do you know what happens while you're saying that? You blink. And it is extraordinarily difficult to keep your eyes unblinking for that. But he was a dear old boy, and I remember talking about signing one day in Brasenose. We're not far from Brasenose, are we? I remember a girl came into the porter's lodge in one summer day, right at the beginning of the Morse series. And this woman came in a lovely summer dress, a lovely day like today, and she was wearing a stole across, and she came through the porter's lodge into the first quad. We have quads here, don't we? In courts in Cambridge, we have quads here. She came across, and as she got nearer, I could see far better, and I could see that she was clutching to her bosom a book, and it said Colin Dexter on this. And I thought, well, this is lovely. She walked right across the lawn. Nobody said anything to her. And she came right across. We were sitting in these, you know those chairs, don't you? Those sort of deep blue canvas chairs. I was sitting there next to John Thor. We were talking about something. And she came across. And as she got nearer, I could see that her large, round, brown eyes were sort of all moist and willing. Do the men know what I mean when I say that? I know what you're thinking now yourselves, yes. You know, this fellow ought to be on Mills and Boone rather than... Anyway, there it was, and she said, could I please have your autograph, please? It's lovely, isn't it? I got my pen out again. And she looked at me straight in the face, and she said, I wasn't talking to you, was I? And she gave the book to John Thor, who put love and affection, my darling, always. John Thor. No glance at me at all. And I didn't say anything. Didn't say anything at all. She walked to the porter's lodge. He didn't turn back and look at either of us, let alone me. And so she went out, and she walked out of my life for the last time, which was rather sad. And I said to John, that's a bloody cheek. It is. I said, I wrote that book, not you. Do you know what he said? He said, you can't win them all, Colin boy, can you? That was the thing that takes over, though, from not being able to think is music. Is music. And we had a bit of a genius in Barrington Phelan, didn't we, who wrote all the music and so on. There are one or two things that made all the difference to the programs. One of them, for example, what was when John had to pretend to have a heart attack in Exeter College in the first quad there. When they were playing, Barrington Phelan was conducting the Fauré Requiem, and certainly Et cum Lazaro quandam paupere, and with Lazarus, who once was a poor man, may you have eternal life. And that at the same time that the John was there. I remember that. It was a lovely thing. And we went to Australia once. One of the great stars in the Morse thing was the city of Oxford, wasn't it? I mean, everybody loves the city of Oxford, especially when the sun is shining, the stone is extraordinarily beautiful. And I don't know whether any of you saw that. It was called the Promise, not the Promised Land or something, whatever it was, but the one in Australia. And John Thor had got his ticket for Der Rosenkavalier, and I don't know how many takes it took, but everybody was walking down the steps of the Sydney Opera House. Everybody walking down, except John Thor, who's got his ticket, and he was walking up, just the one person walking up the steps, and in the background was playing, not my favourite opera, certainly the middle act isn't, but they play the Marschallin at the end of Rosenkavalier, and no opera, even Wagner. Morse tried very hard to interest poor old Lewis in Wagner. He used to say to him, you ought to try Wagner, Lewis, especially Valkyrie, first act of Valkyrie. Oh my goodness me, if only you do that. He's a great man to try. His music, it's far better than it sounds, he used to say. Anyway, that was, I don't know whether that was supposed to be a rather snide comment on the lack of any sort of culture with either a big C or small C in Australia. But I remember that. It must have taken ages to get everybody to stop looking at the camera, all these thousands of people walking down. In Oxford, in Oxford, I remember we had a miracle one day. You know the Victoria Arms a bit, some of you, do you? The Victoria Arms, and they were sitting there, and the sun was just going down a great orange ball in the west over the land in the middle of that, and the Banbury Road. And John had to recite a little bit of Houseman, of course, my greatest hero of the lot, ensanguining the skies. How, just as the sun was going down in the western horizon, ensanguining the skies, how heavily it dies into the west away, past touch and sight and sound, not further underground, falls the remorseful day. And dear old John said that with a tremendous feeling. And this is a compensatory element, because you do feel exactly what John is feeling at that particular time. Now, and I'm very conscious that if I'm not careful, I mustn't go on any longer, must I? Especially if you've been sitting and formulating.